Thank you for joining me in our continued study of Get Wisdom. Don't forget, you could purchase your own copy of Get Wisdom on Ron's website, getwisdom.us, or on amazon.com. We are continuing our study through the book Get Wisdom, Making Christian Heroes of Ordinary People. And don't forget to hit that like and subscribe to this channel. The 7 Principles of Christian Heritage is where we are now, the Personal Principles, Chapter 3. We're going to be talking about the Christian principle of covenant individuality. Introduction to the 7 Principles. The 7 Principles of American Christian history and government represent the most apt and convenient form of biblical thinking applied to every area of life, as this author has seen. If these principles are biblical and have produced the fruit of Christian liberty, prosperity, and gospel expansion we claim, they are indeed worthy of study and form the core of this work. Miss Hall and Miss Slater discovered the 4 R's: research, reason, relate, and record. Research, reason, relate, and record, as being the characteristic of colonial America's scholarship. They found the 4 R's in the sermons, educational, governmental, and historical writings of the times. This early American scholarship was both biblical and widespread. The fruits of this scholarship includes the 7 principles, which we have already introduced and now undertake in more depth. Dr. Rushdoony identifies similar principles in works such as This Independent Republic and The One and the Many. The question arises as to the origin of such an historically important development as the 7 Principles. Please bear with this background thought for a moment. How influential ideas grow in the community consciousness is important. From what source did American Christianity arise? What was the theoretical beginning of the 7 Principles as a distinctly Christian philosophy of human life? The answer is bound up in God's providence, where, as believers endeavored to apply the Scriptures to life, these principles simply emerged organically as with the growth of a tree. Men read the Scriptures and tried to put them into practice. Where the fruit was good, the practice persisted. Where refinements of understanding came, they replaced older traditions. The Word of God worked itself into the lives of the people. Thus, Verna Hall, appropriated Dutch theologian and statesman Abraham Kuyper's historical flow of Christianity concept. One of the most distinctive aspects of America is its practical applications of sound theology. The American Christian philosophy is at once biblical and practical. Change on biblical grounds characterizes a lively Christian expression. God's plan for his people was inherent in the seed, not in the discovery that the tree existed. The plan existed in the tree itself, not the cultivation which man applied to it. In providential view of a historical centers of the work of God, not on man, man received these principles and finally documented them, but did not originate them. Man received the fruit of God's provision through his cooperation effort in history. The requirement of God for man, man applied his work in faith in the nature of the tree of God's plan for salvation for mankind. The more diligently man applied himself to the orchard of the Lord, the more the Lord blessed. This is one of the more compelling aspects of the American Christian view. True to form, God is the God of American Christian liberty, and he rightly gets the glory. Therefore, finding a single theoretical heritage would be difficult or impossible. Rather, we seem to have been the happy recipients of yet another tangible gift from God in the lives of many individuals, and finally, in the institutions of a people. If we can accept that premise, then we may go on to use and benefit from the American Christian philosophy. This great heritage was a tacit creed for early American Christians. My hope and encouragement is that it will become a more self-conscious one, not only for ourselves as Americans, but also for every nation. For if these things be truly biblical, we will see unique expressions of the same principles in every people who adopted them. The ladies, as many have affectionately known them, used the 4Rs in their own scholarship to study Christian history and government. Miss Slater, in particular, documented the frequently recurring ideas, which are now called the 7 Principles of America's Christian History and Government, as being the basis of the governmental thinking of the day. The essence of this thinking consists in the idea of Christian liberty, in teaching and learning America's Christian history and government. The statements of the 7 principles apply essentially to civil liberty. Mrs. Hall and Slater primarily sought to restore the institutions which provide the gospel foundations, and Christian liberty is key. Thus, the 7 principles relate America's Christian history and government to their biblical roots. From this initial focus, the 7 principles have emerged as the arguable foundation of America's institutions at every level, from the home to the church, to education, to business, to the arts and sciences, to civil affairs of all kinds. Is it not reasonable that greater institutions would grow out of smaller ones? Get Wisdom builds upon the original documentation of the 7 principles and American Christian method of biblical scholarship. Upon the work of the ladies, Dr. Rushdoony, and many others, Get Wisdom attempts to provide an instructable fast track towards mastering and making a higher order of practice of the method. As the reader may gather, an important pedagogical principle used here is to slow down to hurry up. Spending leisurely and thoughtful time with the ideas presented here will lay a solid foundation for later ready application for educational and life success. Accordingly, we will considerably ruminate from principle to many applications as we go. Moreover, the 7 principles comprehensively represent our walk with Christ and basic doctrine in relation both to people and to the things of creation over which we have Christian dominion. Over time, it became apparent that the 7 principles embrace virtually the whole of the gospel. Because they are principles, or seeds of thought, they expand indefinitely. This is certainly not to say that the 7 principles replace or overshadow the Holy Word. On the contrary, they constantly lead one back to the Word as the only true source of wisdom and knowledge, salvation and faith. What the 7 principles do is to articulate key biblical doctrines in a practical form by which biblical teachings may be described and from which they may be reasoned. One of the strengths of the Get Wisdom program, and the 7 principles in particular, is the ability to focus key biblical ideas, thus forming a handy case, if you will, for carrying the whole counsel of God ready for use. The 7 principles are a convenient middleman. In a nutshell, then, the 7 principles of America's Christian history and government, expanded for universal application, represent an essential American Christian life and educational philosophy. Do not mistake this premise for a simplified, digested version of the gospel, which demands only the use of a checklist. The Get Wisdom program is a fruit of salvation. Get Wisdom demands wisdom. Such wisdom only grows by diligent pursuit of the Lord and his ways. Get Wisdom. See Proverbs chapter 1, 8, 9. The Get Wisdom program is a spiritual process because it works the heart and mind of the believer. Get Wisdom is expansive. The idea of the 7 principles is similar to Christ's 2 commandments, from which he said, "Hang all the law and the prophets." We might say the seven principles are an expansion of the two commandments of Christ, covering the gospel of life from preparation to fullest expression of godly love. After all, Bible-centered Christian people originally apprehended the seven principles. God made these people very high expressions of Christian liberty, a general and a sustained Christian liberty known in history. They put these principles to work in their own lives, based upon a providential view of history, where God's work in the past is fuel for the future. These principles of Christian love and liberty rise once more before to collect and use, for us to collect and use. Then he said to them, "Therefore every scribe instructed concerning the kingdom of heaven is like a householder who brings out of his treasure things new and old." Matthew 13:52. We will attempt specifically to relate the seven principles to the two commandments of Christ as we consider each principle in turn. For the seven principles to be of use, they must be truly biblical. The Christian ought to prove this for himself. I and many other Bible-centered believers are convinced of such. If the seven principles are true and comprehensive, they provide representation of key absolutes from which to reason in applying Christianity to every area of life. As you master them, you will find them convenient as a measure for making Bible-based decisions. Admittedly, I was a bit skeptical and did not immediately embrace the seven principles. To many, eccentric, unbiblical ideas seemed compelling at first. About 8 full months of study were required to vindicate this approach and these principles to myself. At first, I used only the 4 R's of this approach: to study education, because they were more obviously biblical to me. I then began to see the seven principles everywhere I looked. I am now indeed convinced of their validity. Praise God for a comprehensive method of learning which he has led to so much fruit in so many lives. As one begins to apprehend the principles for oneself, there is a temptation to try mechanically to impose them on everything. Please be assured that once one becomes proficient in the vocabulary of liberty, which the Get Wisdom program represents, the principles will manifest themselves everywhere one looks. This is because the principles are inherent in the subjects. If God puts them there, man need not impose them. On the other hand, at very first skill is a discipline. In the learning phase, academic exercise, where one more pointedly seeks to identify the seven principles in a given subject, provides a foundation for future mastery. We encourage such academic exercises, though never as an end in themselves. Government denotes a directing and controlling force. Besides the seven principles of America's Christian history and government are fundamental, the governmental principles they provide for the basis for developing personal character, personal government, and for organization of the subject, government over it, for true Christian domain. So what does God have to do with the seven principles presented at an elementary level for this introductory volume? The answer lies in a true theology or knowledge of God and his purpose. With respect to each principle, the next section on the seven principles will have as its task the development of such an elementary theology, as well as a practical explanation for each principle. In other words, we will go from origin and principle to particular, so that we may begin to establish a fundamental understanding. Well, next week, we'll begin the first of the 3 principles. These are the foundational and personal principles. They focus on God's nature reflected on creation and the inward parts of man, stressing the individual and his internal character and government in conventional relationship to God. The last 4 principles stress the outworking of The last 4 principles stress the outworking of covenantal individuality and character in relationship and all stewardship expressions of kinds. Let us begin with the Christian principle of covenant individuality, the Christian principle of self-government, and America's heritage of Christian character. And that'll do it for today, as we got a lot to cover. But thank you for tuning in. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. And I just want to apologize ahead of time. I'm having trouble with my equipment, so I cannot pre-record and edit the audio at this time. We're working on it. But thank you for being patient with me. Have a great week in the Lord, and we'll see you next week on The Truth Must Be Told. Don't forget to join us Saturday as we continue to study false teachings. And we're just glad to see you. God bless you. Have a wonderful week.